everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back to my channel and to the 32nd episode of Mondays with Margaret. Today we are going to be taking a look at this chunky novel, Alias Grace. Some of you may know this story from the Netflix limited series. It is a 6-episode show and it was filmed in Toronto and at Kingston Penitentiary. And I was able to go on an adventure and tour the penitentiary in 2018. So I will share some of my pictures from that tour at the end of the video. Alias Grace was originally published in 1996, and it is a historical fiction novel inspired by true events. The main character, Grace Marks, was a real person who was 16 years old in 1843. When she was charged along with James McDermott for murdering her employer, Thomas Kinnear, and his housekeeper, Nancy Montgomery. James was hanged, and Grace's lawyer, Kenneth Mackenzie, was able to keep her from the gallows, and basically he did this by saying that she was young and simple-minded. Grace would spend 29 years in Canada's famous penitentiary in Kingston. And some people thought that she was truly innocent, and others really believed that she was insane. And I kind of think of this story as Canada's Lizzie Borden, in that there is so much mystery and intrigue around it. There are still so many unanswered questions, including like what happened to Grace when she was pardoned, although Atwood in this book imagines a plausible future for her. Atwood first learned of Grace Marks because of Susanna Moodie and her book Life in the Clearings versus the Bush. And if you've been following this series, then you know we have talked about Susanna Moodie many times. And she has influenced Atwood's writing like way more than I originally realized. So Susanna had visited Grace twice, once at Kingston Penitentiary and once at the asylum in Toronto. And in the novel, Atwood alludes to these visits, and she quotes from Susanna's book a number of times. Susanna writes in her book that Grace was in love with Thomas Kinnear and was jealous of Nancy Montgomery. Whereas Atwood tells the story a little differently. So in Alias Grace, we meet Grace when she is 24 years old and she's in Kingston Penitentiary. And the story is told from two perspectives. It is written in the first person when Grace is sharing her story. And she does this when she is sharing what she remembers with Dr. Simon Jordan, who is a psychiatrist that comes from the US to assess her. The second perspective is written in third person, but really it gives the insight into Dr. Jordan and his thoughts and feelings and his storyline. So Atwood uses poetry, letters, and several quotes to tell the story and give it more depth. And I want to share with you what it says on page 6 in my edition because I absolutely loved how this paragraph was written. It's 1851. I'll be 24 years old next birthday. I've been shut up in here since the age of 16. I am a model prisoner and give no trouble. That's what the governor's wife says. I have overheard her saying it. I'm skilled at overhearing. If I am good enough and quiet enough, perhaps after all they will let me go. But it's not easy being quiet and good. It's like hanging onto the edge of a bridge when you've already fallen over. You don't seem to be moving, just dangling there, and yet it is taking all your strength. I love that metaphor that Atwood uses in this, and I just think it's fantastic. So I've already talked about the main characters, but there are several others, including Grace's parents and siblings, which you do learn a little bit about as you do get a background to Grace's life before the family immigrated to Canada from Ireland. But there's also another character that is quite important, and I can't forget her, and that is Mary Whitney. So at first I thought She could be a figment of Grace's imagination or some kind of alter personality. Grace mentioned her often, and she would say that she was her friend. And she is a very significant character, so you need to remember her. There are several hot topics and themes in this story. The death penalty, incarceration, abortion, mental illness, and as I said, there are some who believe that Grace is mad, and there are some reasons to believe that she may have possibly had a multiple personality disorder. Memory is another theme, much like we saw in Cat's Eye, where one of the ways that people cope is to forget the trauma. So in Grace's case, she cannot remember the murders, and she is believed to have amnesia, and that is one of the things that Dr. Jordan is trying to help her with. And then there is also double standards of gender and roles. And so often throughout the book, Grace will make comments about, how things are for men and not for women, or vice versa. She is very observant of people and understands things in her own way. Dreams are also a big part of the story, and they give depth and meaning. And we saw this in The Robber Bride. And here Atwood uses it to show us Grace's subconscious as well as Dr. Jordan's. Religion and faith are also a theme that we've seen before, and it exists in this novel as well. Grace has a belief in God and talks about prayer and theology, and there is a real spirituality about her, and there are predictions and spirits in the story, and Grace might even be a little superstitious. And there's a play on words when talking about divine grace, and I'd like to share with you what Grace says about divine grace and what she also says about God. And this is in chapter 28. It's a long bit, but I think that it's worth it. It begins on page 302, and this will give you a bit of an insight into who Grace is and how she thinks. This is before the murders and they are going to church. The minister looked like a heron, with a pointed beak of a nose and a long skinny neck and a tuft of hair sticking up from the top of his head. The sermon was on the subject of divine grace and how we could be saved by it alone, and not through any efforts on our own part, or any good works we might do. But this did not mean we should stop making efforts or doing good works, but we could not count on them, or be certain that we had been saved just because we were respected for our efforts and good works, because divine grace was a mystery, and the recipients of it were known to God alone. And although Scripture said that by their fruits you would know them, the fruits meant were spiritual fruits, and not visible to any but God alone. And although we must and should pray for divine grace, we should not be so puffed up with vanity as to believe that our prayers might have any effect. Because man proposes, but God disposes, and it was not up to our puny, sinful, and mortal souls to determine the course of events. The first would be last, and the last would be first, and some that had been warming themselves by worldly fires for many years would soon find themselves roasting in something a good deal hotter, much to their indignation and surprise. And there were many white sepulchres walking around in our midst, fair on the outside, but filled with rot and corruption within. And we should be aware of the woman sitting at the door of her house, which Proverbs 9 warns of, or of any such who might tempt us by saying that stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant, because, as Scripture tells, the dead are there, and her guests are in the depths of hell, and above all should guard against complacency, like the foolish virgins, and should not let out our lamps, because no man knew the day and the hour thereof, and we must wait in fear and trembling. He went on this way for some time, and I found myself examining the bonnets of the ladies present, as much as I could see of them from the back, and the flowers on their shawls, and I said to myself that if you could not get divine grace by praying for it, or any other way, or ever know if you had it or not, then you might as well forget about the whole matter, or go about your own business, because whether you would be damned or saved was no concern of yours. There is no use crying over spilt milk if you don't know whether the milk is spilt or not. And if God alone knew, then God alone could tidy it up if necessary. But thinking about such matters makes me drowsy, and the minister had a droning voice, and I was on the verge of nodding off, when we were all on our feet singing Abide With Me, or so I recall, which was not very well sung by the congregation, but at least it was music, which is always a consolation. Nancy and I were not greeted warmly by any as we went out, but rather avoided, although some of the poorer sort nodded, and there were whisperings as we went past, which I found odd, as although I was an unknown, Nancy herself must have been familiar to them, and though the gentry or those who fancied themselves such need not notice her, she did not deserve such treatment from the farmers and their wives, and from the others there who hired out as servants. Nancy held her head up high and did not look to left or right, and I thought, these are cold and proud people and not good neighbors. They are hypocrites. They think the church is a cage to keep God in, so he will stay locked up there and not go wandering about the earth during the week, poking his nose into their business and looking into the depths and darkness and doubtness of their hearts and their lack of true charity. And they believe they need only be bothered about him on Sundays when they have their best clothes on and their faces straight and their hands washed and their gloves on and their stories all prepared. But God is everywhere and cannot be caged in as men can. The theme of death might be an obvious one because it is a story about a double murder, but there is other deaths and grieving as well. And maybe most importantly, and almost very subtly, is the theme of hope. The book also has tons of symbols, beginning with the chapter titles that are all named after quilt patterns, and quilts are mentioned throughout the story. There is the symbols of apples and fruit, both literal fruit, the fruits of the spirit. There are pictures of fruit. The same is true of flowers. They are mentioned throughout the story, and either the flowers are seen or smelled or they're in art. And like in The Handmaid's Tale, the color red has significance in this novel as well. So I really enjoyed the story, and it is in my top 5 of Atwood novels so far. I loved the writing and the mystery that Atwood creates, and my favorite thing is probably the foreshadowing. It is done brilliantly, and it still makes you wonder what to believe. So as I said, I was able to tour Kingston Penitentiary a few years ago, and I have always been fascinated by prisons, and this tour was fantastic. I learned so much. If you have seen the Netflix series, then these staircases will probably be familiar, as they filmed some of the scenes here. And we also saw some of the cell blocks, the classrooms of the school, and where inmates worked. And we were told some of the stories about some of the escape attempts, some of them actually successful. And across the street, they have turned some of the buildings into a museum. And that was really cool to see what they had in there as well. So there was some information that was in the cells for new inmates that tell them about things like laundry, outside mail, if they need to see a dentist or doctor. And there was also rules from 1900 that had to be followed by inmates, which was quite a lengthy list. So if you get a chance to visit Kingston, I highly recommend checking out this tour. Let me know if you have read Alias, Grace. What did you think of the novel? Or if you've seen the Netflix series, did you like it? I personally like the novel better, but the series is good, so check it out if you haven't already. Or let me know if you've been to Kingston Penitentiary, preferably if you've went on a tour like I did. You don't need to tell me if you did any time at Kingston Penitentiary. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.